So I really have just one question for you. How many of Epstein's co-conspirators have you indicted? How many perpetrators are you even investigating?
This administration released over 3 million pages of documents, over 3 million, and Donald Trump signed that law to release all of those documents. He is the most transparent president in the nation's history. And none of them asked Merrick Garland over the last 4 years one word about Jeffrey Epstein. How ironic is that? You know why? Because Donald Trump, the Dow right now is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing.
She had one job. One, not to win an argument, not to impress her boss, not to perform loyalty on national television. Her job was to answer the question. She couldn't do it. And the moment she failed, the moment she chose a stock market number over a survivor's outstretched hand, the mask didn't slip. It shattered. What you're about to see isn't just a bad hearing. It's a document, a record, a time-stamped piece of American history that proves exactly what this Department of Justice has become and who it answers to. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand something that most people watching that hearing missed entirely. Let's start with the simplest question imaginable. When a senator walks into a hearing room and asks the sitting Attorney General of the United States how many of Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirators have been charged, that is not a political question. That is a math question. Give me a number. One word. One number, that's it. Pam Bondi's response, 3 million documents. The Dow Jones Industrial Average. Donald Trump's historic legacy. I want you to sit with that for a second, because the dissonance of what just happened in that hearing room is almost too large to process in real time. A United States senator asked the nation's top law enforcement officer to account for the criminal investigation into one of the most documented, most named, most connected child exploitation networks in modern American history, and the Attorney General responded with the stock market. Now here's what that tells you, and this is important. It doesn't tell you she's stupid. She has a law degree. She ran a state prosecution office. She knows exactly how to answer a direct question, which means the choice not to answer was deliberate. And deliberate evasion at that level from that chair is not a communications mistake. It is a decision. The question is who made it and why. If it had happened once, you could call it nerves. If it had happened twice, you could call it strategy. But it happened over and over and over again, with a precision that starts to feel less like panic and more like programming. Every serious question, same sequence. Attack the questioner, praise the president, pivot to an unrelated economic indicator, repeat. It wasn't random. It was a rotation, a script, a failsafe, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The most chilling example, when a member of Congress asked Bondi directly, point blank, whether the Department of Justice was refusing to cooperate with state and local law enforcement investigating the deaths of 2 American citizens, not hypothetical citizens, not abstract victims, real names, real cases, real families waiting for answers. What did she say? I find it interesting that she keeps going after President Trump, the greatest president in American history. Pause. The head of the Department of Justice was just asked whether her department was blocking murder investigations. Her answer was a compliment to her boss. Think about the mechanics of that moment. To give that answer, to hear a question about dead Americans and immediately translate it into an opportunity to perform loyalty, something has gone catastrophically wrong in how that office understands its own purpose. An attorney general is not a surrogate. She is not a campaign spokesperson. She is not a hype woman. She is the chief law enforcement officer of 330 million Americans. And in that hearing room, not a single one of them was present in her answers. But here's where it gets darker, much darker, because what happened in that hearing room wasn't just evasion. There's evidence captured in a photograph, analyzed by reporters, now spreading across every major political outlet, that suggests the Department of Justice may have done something that goes far beyond deflection. While Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal was pressing Bondi on the Epstein files, a photographer in the hearing room captured something unexpected. Sitting in Pam Bondi's open binder, the document folder of the sitting Attorney General of the United States, at a congressional hearing, in full public view, was a page with Jayapal's name at the top. Not a legislative record, not a prepared statement, a search history, a detailed log of every single Epstein document that Congresswoman Jayapal had viewed through the Justice Department's restricted access system. the system Congress uses to read the unredacted files. When that image went public, J. Apple didn't mince words. She described it as totally inappropriate and asked a question that should keep every American up at night. Did the Department of Justice give members of Congress early access to those Epstein files, specifically so they could monitor which Democrats were looking at what, and prepare opposition research in advance of the hearing? Read that again. The question is not whether the DOJ had politic motivations. The question is whether the DOJ used classified file access as a surveillance tool against sitting members of Congress to gain tactical advantage in a public oversight hearing. If that's true, and the photograph suggests it is absolutely worth asking, then what happened in that room wasn't just a bad performance. It was an operation. I need to slow down here, because what I'm about to describe is the single most important moment of the entire hearing, and it's the one that got the least attention. As the hearing progressed, a congresswoman asked the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes, the actual, living, breathing human beings who had endured what he did to them, to stand up. They stood. Then she asked them to raise their hands if they had still not been granted a single meeting with this Department of Justice. Every hand went up, every single one. And then, in what may be the defining image of this entire story, she turned to Pam Bondi and asked her to turn around, to face the survivors standing directly behind her, to look at them. Bondi didn't turn, she didn't move, she kept her eyes forward. I want you to understand what that moment cost. These are women and men who were abused as children by a network of powerful people who spent decades using wealth and influence and institutional protection to avoid accountability. They came to Washington. They sat in a congressional hearing room. They stood up in public, some of them for the very first time, just to be seen. And the woman whose department holds the files, whose office controls the prosecution, whose job description literally exists to pursue justice for people exactly like them, couldn't turn around. That cold, deliberate stillness was not an accident. It was a choice, and it said more about the current state of American justice than every word Pam Bondi spoke that entire day. And then it got worse. Congresswoman Becca Balint, a Jewish woman whose grandfather was murdered in the Holocaust, stood up and demanded that Bondi agree to meet with the survivors. It was an emotional moment, a real one. So what did Pam Bondi do? She accused her of anti-Semitism. Let that settle. The Attorney General of the United States, when confronted by a congresswoman who personally lost family in the Holocaust, on the subject of child sex abuse survivors, deployed anti-Semitism as a weapon, not as a concern, not as a conversation, as a shield. Balint's response was immediate. Are you serious? Talking about anti-Semitism to a woman who lost her grandfather in the Holocaust. The room erupted. And what happened next tells you everything you need to know about the strategy behind this hearing, because Bondi didn't apologize. She didn't pause, she didn't recalibrate, she doubled down. That's not a mistake, that's a methodology. When cornered, attack. When outmatched, escalate. When asked to show decency, find a weapon. And then, in a moment that felt almost surreal, as Bondi sparred with a congresswoman who had just invoked her murdered grandfather, she pivoted back to Trump's legacy, the strength of the economy, and the failures of the previous administration. She said the name Merrick Garland 11 times in a single hearing. The man hasn't held office in months. But she needed him there, like a prop, like armor. Because every time she said his name, she bought herself another few seconds without having to say the one word that mattered most: accountability. Here's the part they won't say on television. There's a specific question, a direct, legitimate, documented question, about whether the current sitting president of the United States attended social events hosted by Jeffrey Epstein at which underage girls were present. That question was asked in the hearing. Bondi called it ridiculous. But here's the thing about calling a question ridiculous. If you know the answer is no, the word no takes less than a second to say. It requires no preparation, no legal review, no political clearance. It's one syllable. She didn't say it. She said ridiculous. Those are not the same thing. And in the gap between those two words, in the silence where no should have lived, sits one of the most important unanswered questions in American political life right now. Because Jeffrey Epstein's network was not a rumor. It was documented, photographed, testified to under oath, logged in flight records and black books and court depositions that are now finally, after years of sealed vaults, partially in the public record. And the Attorney General, when asked whether any of it touched the sitting president, said ridiculous and pivoted to the stock market. The survivors sitting in that room had their hands raised. The files still exist. The co-conspirators are still uncharged. And the Attorney General of the United States spent 4 hours on Capitol Hill performing loyalty rather than pursuing justice. Here is what we know, not opinion. Not framing, not narrative, what we know. Jeffrey Epstein's network abused children for decades. The names of his associates, his clients, his guests, his co-conspirators are documented. Some are in sealed records. Some have never been named publicly. The Department of Justice has the files. The survivors have been waiting for a meeting for over a year. They stood up in that hearing room and raised their hands. The Attorney General refused to look at them. When asked about charging co-conspirators, she quoted the Dow. When asked about murdered American citizens, she quoted the President. When asked about surveillance of congressional members through DOJ file access, she attacked. When asked to face the survivors, she looked away. And when confronted by a woman whose grandfather died in the Holocaust, asked simply to show human decency to children who were abused, she reached for anti-Semitism as a rhetorical weapon. That is not a malfunction. That is not nerves. That is a Department of Justice that has decided it serves one person. And until that changes, until there is accountability, until there are charges, until the survivors get the meeting they have been denied for years, every hearing like this one is not oversight. It's theater. The question is not whether you're angry. You should be. The question is what you do with it. Because silence at this point is not neutrality, it's permission. And the survivors, still standing, hands still raised, are still waiting for someone in power to finally look them in the eye.